Okay. So, next slide. These two verses, I keep thinking this will do all, but it won't. I've come to bring fire on the earth. That's a really good verse for a Scottish Presbyterian. A bit of fire and brimstone, stir things up. So my apologies. We may not get much further than these two verses. But it won't all be doom and gloom. You'll be pleased to know. Oh, good. First, as an introduction, we need to remind ourselves of who Jesus is as the God-man. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, the writer says, He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him, by this man, Jesus, all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. Jesus was no ordinary dude. He is the eternal Son of God. And he became human, completely, totally human. I can't even begin to imagine what that felt like for Jesus. Being the eternal, perfect, holy, righteous Son of God and becoming fully human and entering completely into human life. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And in verse 19, it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, all the fullness of God dwelt bodily in Jesus, within the limitations of his human frame. I mean, how do we begin to make sense of it? So the reason I'm going to labor these verses is because I think it gives us an insight into what this meant for Jesus. So, in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10, it says this. Yeah, I've only put up there the Lucan verses. It says, the day of the Lord, that last final day of creation as we currently know it, that day, there will be a final day when God shuts up shop, if you like, for this creation as we know it, when he calls time. That day will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. That day will bring about the end of creation as we know it, but it will also usher in a whole new creation in which only righteousness and goodness will live. I have come, Jesus says, to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. Jesus struggled. He wrestled. He had to keep wrestling between his place in this life and his desire to usher in the new creation. He knew that that day was coming. He knew what it would entail. And his will, he wills it, that day to be already kindled, when the old, fallen, broken creation, broken through sin, broken through human culpability, will end, and a new day will dawn. Jesus wrestled. I want to read from Isaiah 53. It says, he was a man of great pain. Yeah, it's the next slide. He was a man of great pain, a man of sorrows, and familiar with grief, familiar with suffering. But we don't see that worked out in the human life of Jesus very often. But here he starts to give us an insight into what it meant for him as a human being to carry the burden of also being the Son of God. Isaiah goes on, but surely he took up our pain and he bore our suffering. Jesus came in love to save. He came in love to rescue. But that ministry is time limited. That ministry will cease when the final day wraps everything up that was in that diary of the past and will usher in a whole new calendar that will go on for eternity. My watch is meant to be eternal, it says. I don't have to keep adjusting the date. It does it automatically. It knows from month to month. I don't know how it does it, but it says it will work eternally. Wow. I don't think so. I don't expect to be wearing this in glory. But that calendar, that new refreshed age will go on forever. And in his heart, Jesus longs for that day to come. John the Baptist says earlier in Luke that he, Jesus, will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand to thoroughly clear his threshing floor and to gather the wheat into his barn, but he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. Winnowing was a very down-to-earth, ordinary process that all of Jesus' audience would have known, seen, and understood. The separating out of the wheat, the grain, from the chaff. And that the wheat was useful and valuable, but the chaff was just fit for burning. As a young kid, I used to go to my uncle's farm, and they grew their own barley just for cattle field. And he still used an old wooden winnowing fork to separate out the chaff, because when you're feeding that to young calves, sometimes if there's too much chaff, it would choke the calves. They would kind of breathe it in because it's so light and fragile. And I still remember these clouds of dust and chaff blowing in the wind up the drive of the farm. So the whole notion of separating out would have been well understood by Jesus' audience, that his ministry involved a distinguishing between the wheat and the chaff. But again, in the next part, if you go back a slide, please. I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. What a weight, what a burden, how pressed down I feel until that baptism is completed. And this is part of where the tension comes for Jesus, because he was baptized by John into a baptism of repentance that he did not need to undergo, but he identified himself completely with sinful human beings, knowing that through that identification that some would be saved, that some would be fit and prepared by his grace and his mercy through the cleansing of his blood sacrifice for life in that brand new calendar. But that others wouldn't come. That others wouldn't come. For this man of love, that must have been painful. That must have torn at Jesus' heart. I know he hates sin. He hates some of the things that we do, some of the things that we say, some of the things that we think. He hates it. But he loves you. His compassion, his mercy is always uppermost in his thinking when he thinks about any human being. But his ministry and the burden he carried is because his very presence in the world causes separation. Some embraced him, accepted him, welcomed his coming, and others wanted nothing to do with him and just wanted to obliterate him from the face of the earth. The nearest modern word to the Greek that's translated in this version, constraint, is depressed. Jesus felt weighed down by that tension that his love created for him, knowing that some of the people that he was sharing the words of life with would not receive, and carrying the burden of knowing the consequences of that decision, that action or inaction on their part. What we see, it's the crushing, jarring disconnect between this man of love and the consequences for some people of his presence in the world. Imagine this in 2 Corinthians 5:20 and 21. Paul says, "We beg you, on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. Get right with God. We beg you." But what we see shadowed behind Paul begging is Jesus begging. Accept what I came to do on your behalf. Receive it. Be saved. Because I hate the thought of you being lost. Can you understand what that must have done to this man? Seeing absolutely clearly the consequences of his life's work on the planet, and knowing the eternal consequences for some people were not going to be good. Luke goes on, if you flip forward too. "Do you think I came to bring peace on the earth?" Now he did. The Old Testament ends with a statement that the Son of Righteousness, when he comes, would bring reconciliation and healing. But not everyone receives it. And in not receiving it, people bring conflict. I tell you, division, but not division as something that delighted Jesus. He hated it. He came to bring that tender reconciliation, first of all, between a human being and God, but also between human beings. He will turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children, and the hearts of the children back to the fathers. That was his intended purpose for all his time here on this planet. But carrying the weighty burden, knowing that that ministry would be rejected by many. From now on, there will be 5 in one family, divided against each other, 3 against 2, 2 against 3. They'll be divided, father against son, son against father. I can testify to this truth in my own family, not my kids, thankfully. They made the right decision. But my father, he was very high up in the Freemasons in Scotland. And when I came home and said I've been saved, well, I was thrown out. And as far as I know, he never repented. He died a number of years ago. And that's hard. Next slide, Luke 12, 54 to 59. So I'm sorry, this is all on the same theme. You're not getting any remission at this point. Jesus is driving home his message. Again, using a very human illustration. So we say, red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in the morning, shepherd's warning. They were doing the same back in his day. When you see a cloud rising in the west, out over the Mediterranean, westerly wind prevailing, we're going to get rain. That wind is going to bring moisture over, it's going to rain. And it does. Hey. When the south wind blows, you say it's going to be hot. And it is. Jesus says, hypocrites, he says, you spend your time working out how things are going to be on the planet. Even little things like weather. I'm amazed at the intensity that some people apply to trying to predict how the markets are going to behave. People who have investments and things like that, always looking to see where the next best deal is going to be. He says, why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? And then he tells a story. Someone is taking you to court. You've stuffed up and someone is taking you to court. You know you've stuffed up. You carry a full understanding of what you did wrong and you're being marched to court. You will spend every effort to try and be reconciled to your adversary before you get into court. Because you know the consequences of letting this run its course until you appear before the judge. I'm sure we all understand that. We had an elder in our church in Aberdeen. He was a senior police inspector with Grampian Police Force. But he'd started in the traffic police. And Gordon used to love getting out on the bikes, the motorbikes. And one day, our pastor was driving. Gordon had a wicked sense of humor. Lights on, siren going, flagged Douglas down. And Douglas said, I could feel the palms of my hands sweating on the wheel as I pulled in, thinking, was I speeding? What was I doing wrong? I've got a light out. He was absolutely sweating. And that is our response in the face of authority. If you're driving along and you hear a police siren coming up behind you, instantly you look at your speed. We all know what this feels like. Jesus calls them hypocrites because reading and interpreting the weather, they understood the role of authority on the planet, but they weren't putting in the effort to ensure that they were reconciled to the eternal heavenly judge. And that was Jesus' concern for them. His love and his mercy. You need to apply thought and effort into making sure that when you come before the final judge, that you are right with him, that there are no outstanding debts. And the good news is that Jesus has potentially paid for all of our outstanding debts. But we need to receive them and embrace them Luke 13, 1-5. So, King Herod had some worshipping Jews murdered in the temple, mixed their human blood with their sacrifices, polluting the whole thing. And some people thought they must have been bad people for that to happen to them. And Jesus says, no. Get that out of your head. They were no worse than you are. And then Jesus throws in another illustration. There was a wall that fell and killed 18 people. And he knew that in the Jewish mind, there was that thought, they must have been a lot worse than us. There was something really nasty about them. And that's why God killed them. And Jesus says, no, you will all perish just the same. They were no worse than you. Driving home the message, there is a judgment to come. God is not so nice that if you die without Christ, he will change his mind and say, oh, well, I can see you're quite a nice person, really. You just stuffed up a bit. Okay, you don't need Jesus. Come on in. It's not going to happen. Jesus is reminding them, what you see worked out in the lives of those people that you think were awful, they're no worse than you, but if that worked out for them, you make the link. That's how it's going to work out for you. And then, carrying that burden of love, he's desperate to show again that it's time limited. So the last little parable, a man had a fig tree growing in his vineyard. He went to look for fruit on it, just like God looks for the fruit of righteousness in us. He didn't find any. So he said to the gardener, right, for 3 years now I've been coming to look for fruit on this fig tree, getting nothing. Why should it take up space in the soil? Cut it down. But the gardener says, leave it for 1 more year. Not leave it indefinitely, but leave it 1 more year. I will tend it. I'll dig around it. I'll fertilize it. And if it bears fruit next year, because of all the loving attention we've given it, fine. If it doesn't, cut it down. The offers of grace are time limited. They're not indefinite. And it puts a huge responsibility on us to make sure that we receive the offers of grace that we see worked out in the tensions at work in Jesus. I have a baptism to be baptized with. I identified fully with sinful mankind that I might save them. But if they don't receive it, if they won't receive it, if they won't waken up, then I need to accept. Jesus needs to accept. They will be lost. All hope gone. I saw a sign in London near Tower Bridge, and it says, hell has no exit. Heaven has one door. And his name is Jesus. You don't want to end up in hell, which has no exit. But there's only one door into heaven. And it's Jesus. And what we see in the life of Jesus is a burden. because he knew that some would not come, some would not receive. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses writes, "See, I have set before you today life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life. Choose blessing." But there is a choice. I hope that didn't come across as too fire and brimstony, because I know the cost to Jesus. I've wrestled with this for weeks now. The cost to Jesus was immense, because his intended purpose was to save and bless. But there is a choice that we control, that we need to make. If God has spoken to you at all, and you're not sure whether you've really seen that choice, maybe not as clearly, this is a choice concerning your eternal well-being. Not just a little bit of help to get through this life. That is an added bonus, but it's not the main deal in the offer. The main deal is eternal well-being and salvation, coming from the loving heart of Jesus. I'm doing this for you, and it's not easy. Then don't leave the building and let that conviction slide off your shoulders. Make the choice today to receive that blessing of life that Jesus lived his life and eventually gave it to provide for you. Please don't. Alan, John, Graham, Barry, Trevor, Chris, heaps. It's all men. Sorry. You can speak to a woman as well. A godly woman. Speak to someone and just make sure that the deal is done. Our younger son invited Jesus into his life 4 or 5 times when he was very young. And we said, "Nathan, you've already asked Jesus into you." He said, "I'm just making sure, Dad. I'm just making sure. Just make sure."